Alternate history about an Axis victory has always been a popular spot for historical speculation, and why wouldn't it be? World War II is the defining point of the 20th century, and it has such a simple narrative to follow. Just a couple of my favorite personal alternatives are: if they invaded Turkey/the Middle East instead of Russia for oil, if Mussolini's government wasn't competent, i.e. took Greece, didn't waste resources attacking Ethiopia, or getting stopped in the Balkans, if they didn't waste resources on the Holocaust or brain drain the country of Jewish talent, keeping America out of the war by any means necessary, invading Russia from both east and west with the Japanese, or continuing to partition Eastern Europe with Russia and consolidating power in the region, or not bombing British civilian cities and instead forcing them to sue for peace. Had they done any of these above, it could have convinced some of the last neutral parties that were mostly on Germany's side to throw in with them. The Nazi Blitzkrieg offensive seems like a force of nature, consuming everything in its path until it overextended and paid the consequences of such. And while the ferocity of the expansion is nothing to scoff at, would it have stayed together even if they had won the war? Take it from the man himself. Hitler believed that the lack of precise economic program was one of the Nazi Party's strengths, saying, "The basic feature of our economic theory is that we have no theory at all. A feature of fascism is that it is disconnected from reality, and such leaders rarely follow a coherent worldview with rational policies. It's what separates the successful from the unsuccessful dictatorships, as its greatest strength is the ability for unilateral action with zero justification. It can either be the preemptive solution to a major problem that would cause chaos in the future, or a ruler mashing industry to their will to pursue their own irrational beliefs." Hitler had a ruined economy and 5 million Reichsmarks left in the government coffers. Hitler had 5 major issues that he wanted to face. From his own memo, the primary problems were the grain/foodstuff shortage, the decreased production of the German industry, the marked unemployment, complete economic independence of Germany, and the complete rearmament of the country. The manner in which he went about doing these were varied and mostly effective in and of themselves. Unfortunately, to start, they only had 1 million Reichsmarks left in capital. Hitler appointed Helmer Schmaltz, a former member of the German Democratic Party, as president of the Reich Bank in 1933 and Minister of Economics in 1934. He devised a scheme known as MEFO bills, which were successors to the previous government's OFA bills. He began by opening a shell company known as Metallurgic Metallurgic Research Corporation. He put $1 million of capital behind it. His company, which I'll be calling MEFO from now on, was completely private on paper. The company then began offering contracts to arm manufacturers and other industries necessary for war. MEFO didn't pay in hard cash. Instead, it issued bills of exchange with extendable 6-month term. These became known as MEFO bills. So MEFO would ask for $50 million worth of goods and would pay in MEFO bills equivalent to the $50 million plus the 4% interest if they waited 6 months to cash it. After 6 months, they could continue the contract with the same growing interest. Schalt, as president of the Reich Bank, agreed to underwrite these bills so that if MEFO was unable to pay, the Reich Bank would. However, the MEFO had no real capital to speak of, so the Reich Bank would always pay these back. The entire house of cards threatened to expire in 1939 because the MEFO bills were set to expire in 5 years. This would cause the government to have to pay all of them at once, and if it couldn't, it would have to declare bankruptcy. Schalt issued short-term government bonds to replace the MEFO bills, and he also came up with a scheme to use assets confiscated from Germany's Jews as collateral for new loans. Eventually, however, he had to come to Hitler and tell him that the only way to prevent bankruptcy was to stop spending so much money on arms. Hitler was furious at the very idea, and in January in 1939, had Schalt dismissed from his post. Financial ruin was instead staved off briefly by looting the National Bank of Czechoslovakia in March 1939. By August, Hitler had his eyes on Poland's central bank as well. It can't be overstated how illegal what they did was, which was why they did it. It was against the Treaty of Versailles, in which he unsurprisingly also refused to pay the reparations from. The advantage of this was that it allowed the German government to take huge amounts of debt without showing it on their finances, to avoid inflation from just printing money, essentially. and it allowed them to rearm at mass scale, relatively undetected. This then led manufacturers' mass hiring for these contracts would send the economy soaring. At that point, weapons were 10% of the gross national product. The Nazis were very much the opinion that enterprises should be privatized whenever possible. This had the advantage of increasing funds when they most needed it. Several banks, shipyards, railway lines, shipping lines, welfare organizations that the Weimar government had acquired post-depression were privatized. It got to the point where 1.4% of the government revenue was from privatized industries. To boost production, he favored cartels and monopolies over small businesses. He completely banned trade unions and froze worker wages. An October 1937 policy dissolved companies valued less than $40,000 and made it impossible to start companies without capital of $200,000, which destroyed 1/5 of all small businesses. Nazi Germany did impressively make unemployment zero, but once you look closer at the numbers, it kind of falls apart. First, they bankrolled the investment for most of the industries and kept wages low. They incentivized mass employment. At the same time, they barred undesirables, slashed Jews from working, even actively firing those already employed. They prevented women from working. They spent little on social welfare, which allowed them to find any able-bodied men left over who would force employment in the military. However, if you look at the US entering World War II, they had a pretty similar trajectory, with their unemployment hitting record lows in the wartime economy. Hitler's final objective was to create an autarky, a fully insular and self-sufficient Germany, and an autocracy. He ended up not succeeding, not for lack of trying though. He put very high tariffs on imports, but the country still didn't have the resources to be completely insular. Hitler would amend this with trade deals with Central European countries whom he'd look at hungrily. To deal with fuel shortages, they turned coal to gasoline. To create a fully integrated Germany, he had many large public works, like an expansion of the Autobahn, the Reinhardt program, and also funded the Olympic Stadium, in which he wanted to display the superiority of his country. The beginning of the war led to a British blockade, which considerably restricted Germany to world markets. Because of this, the Germans would introduce rationing, yet barely increase the tax rate, as it was 13.7 at its highest, versus Great Britain's 23.7. Germany was still able to trade with some of its near neighbors, for instance Sweden for iron, or Spain/Portugal for tungsten. If you've ever wondered why Switzerland was never annexed as the last German majority country, it was because it essentially threatened to blow itself up, and its valuable mountain passes between Germany and its greatest ally on the continent. To lose any more supply was completely unacceptable, so the absorption would wait. It was instead used as a useful intermediary and a convenient place to sell all of the plunder that the army had shown up with. Germany was almost always desperate for oil, mostly relying on Romanian gas fields. A technique for converting coal to petrol called coal gasification was used, but that still wasn't enough. They reduced France's supply to just 8% of what it was pre-war. It got so bad that they wouldn't train pilots for tanks or planes with the vehicles on to avoid wasting gas. In fact, both the Americans and the Soviets flat out didn't believe the information that Germany was low on fuel, because they refused to believe that Germany would start a war without enough fuel security. The land that they ended up conquering in Eastern Europe was never as prosperous as the Nazis believed it would be, mostly due to the scorched earth policy of the Soviets. Grain yields fell across the board, down 50% in France, 3 million tons in Yugoslavia and Hungary each. Before Operation Barbarossa, they actually traded large amounts of grain and raw materials for the industrial machinery and weaponry with Soviets. Most of the direct funding of the war came from stolen goods. Nazis would commonly reroute trains in Norway and France to Germany. By some estimates, 20% of European art was displaced by the Nazis. They also stole everything from the prisoners in the death camps, as they'd have to strip naked before entering. Any land or capital that they owned would be taken as well. By 1944, 1/4 of the workforce consisted of forced labor from the POWs. It's impossible to understate the horror of the Holocaust and German war crimes. They essentially paid for the extermination of a peoples with those people's own wealth. The Germans rapidly began spending more on the military by 1942 as the war drew out. The Nazis transitioned to a full wartime economy by 1943, converting civilian factories. Restaurants had to close to focus the German army's needs. By 1944, almost the entire economy was dedicated to military production, but by then, it would still not be enough. Right about then, Allied bombings were destroying many German factories and cities, causing a complete collapse in the German economy. Synthetic fuel, food and military output dive-bombed, pun intended. The issue comes around to the fact that Germany simply didn't have enough natural resources to fund an extended war. It's crippling when you consider that your enemies had control over colonies across the world and infinitely more stable trade routes. It's why my favorite scenario, and most likely for them to win, is where they invade the Middle East instead of Ethiopia and Russia, seizing oil from the area. They would have had to turn or conquer Turkey to accomplish this. So there still would have been major obstacles in the way. Who knew that fighting the next two superpowers and last two great empires at the same time would be a rough fight? The march forward was what fueled the effort. So once it slowed down, it was an exponential decrease in efficiency. The promissory notes and ridiculous increase in the government eventually would have inevitably led to hyperinflation, the very same issue that led to Hitler's rise, ironically. The slave labor that became a sizable amount could have additionally devalued German workers. There was a possibility that everything would have worked out, at least the Nazis didn't win. Given their history and ethos, they probably would have proceeded with the same Nazi simplicity and brutality they showed for everything else.